Hi, my name is Laura Chalmers. I'm the project manager of York Food Bank. And if you've not heard of us before, we are a Christian-based organisation in the city of York, and we run out of 4 centres across the city. And what we aim to do is to provide food for people going through an emergency food crisis. And we work in partnership with referral agencies across the city, so they will be frontline care professionals who would come in contact with people at the point of a crisis. So York Food Bank is a Christian-based charity in the centre of York, and it started back in 2012 at the Gateway Centre. And we realised that a lot of people were kind of presenting themselves in a crisis, and there was no one really to go to for help with food right there and then. And so we opened the food bank, and we realised quite quickly that there was quite a big need, and people couldn't access us. So if you didn't have money for food, you didn't have money for the bus, and so people would get referrals but they couldn't get across to Acomb to see us. We then partnered with churches across the city in the areas of most deprivation in York, and they run food bank centres from their church buildings, which means we now have 4 food bank centres across the city open on different days of the week, so the access should be a lot easier for people. So what that looks like for a client coming to us is that they would get a referral from their GP or their head teacher or wherever, and they would come to the most convenient food bank for them, where they would be welcomed hopefully with a really friendly kind of informal cafe style atmosphere, where they can sit and have a cup of tea and a piece of cake and chat to a volunteer about what's going on in their lives and how we might be able to help. And they would sit with the volunteer and have a conversation, and during the course of that conversation they'd be able to signpost them to other areas of help as well if that's necessary. And in the meantime, a volunteer would go and fill up their food bank parcel, which would be enough food to provide everyone in that household with enough food for 3 meals a day for about a week. So in a kind of tiny nutshell, that's what we do. People can come to us 3 times in any 6-month period. So hopefully we should be able to help them through a crisis rather than week in and week out support. But what we want is to support people and empower people out of their situation rather than ingrain them in it. So currently we see about 150 families a month across the 4 sites, and we've been fairly static at that for the last couple of years. It normally works out at about 3,500 people a year. We see a peak in the summer holidays because a lot of families are not getting their free school meals, which obviously puts a financial burden on them for those 6 or 7 weeks. So we support families during the 6-week holidays, and it always goes up a little bit around Christmas and January as well, understandably. So that's a really big question. I think probably could be split into 2 categories. So I think that food poverty is one issue and food waste is quite a separate issue. So in terms of food poverty, why do I think that that's happening in Britain? Loads of reasons. We have a big divide in our country. Although we have a very wealthy country, the wealth is owned by a limited number of people, which means that there is a big divide between the biggest income and the lowest income. And so often we see in food bank a lot of people coming in not only on low incomes but in insecure work, so a lot of 0-hour contracts, part-time minimum wage jobs, and that doesn't really work when our cost of living and inflation is going up year on year at a higher rate, so more money coming out of the same pot, if that makes sense. And I think in York in particular, we obviously have a really touristy city. There is a lot of affluence in our city, and what that brings is very expensive housing, really high rental market prices, but the work market not so great. So a lot of hospitality, catering, tourist industry kind of work, which is notoriously low paid, and so a lot of people are kind of priced out of being able to live here, or living on the breadline, as we would say, so earning just enough to keep their heads above water, and what goes in goes out. But then when something happens, the car breaks down, someone's made redundant, someone gets ill, there is no plan B or kind of savings or backup for that kind of crisis, which is where kind of debt creeps in a lot of the time. Interestingly, just a couple of weeks ago, JRF released a report about the amount of people who are just about managing they've called it, which we definitely would see at Foodbank, is that there are increasingly kind of your average Joe, if you would like, is just about managing and live on a very precarious kind of line really when it comes to their finances. We also have a massive housing crisis in the country as well. So like I said before, housing costing a lot more, but also a real lack of social housing as well. So people needing temporary accommodation and housing not being suitable, and council stock being limited, which obviously causes a lot of problems as well. And the last 4 years we've seen lots of changes to benefits. So we've had a big welfare reform. The way that we administer benefits looks very different, and some of that has had some negative effects on Foodbank clients as well. And what we've also found is that a lot of things happening all at once. So not necessarily one change to a certain benefit, but lots of different things all at once, which is a catalyst for debt really. And I think we also have some larger, more cultural issues around loneliness and community, and we have a very individualistic culture, which means that we don't really know our neighbours, we don't have massive support networks necessarily, we don't really live near family a lot of the time because we live in a culture where we move around a lot for work or uni or travel. So it does mean when a crisis happens, we're kind of less as a nation really prepared with some kind of safety net, like a social safety net. So, you know, we don't have parents to go to necessarily who can help out or help with childcare because they live too far away. We don't necessarily have a community that can pull together and help us out. And so I find a lot in this country is a lot of hidden poverty. So you might have somebody living down your street who's a single parent who's struggling, or someone who's been made redundant, and you wouldn't necessarily know that because we don't necessarily talk to our neighbours. And so what we find a lot in Foodbank is the kind of social exclusion that comes from living below the poverty line, and the stigma that comes with that as well. So people don't want to talk about it, they try to keep it hidden so people don't really know about it, which is a big part of the problem also. So the second part of the answer to that question about food waste, which is kind of linked but a bit of a separate issue really. If anyone saw the Hughes War on Waste documentary, you might be a bit more clued up about some of these issues. But food waste obviously is being highlighted a lot more in the media in the last kind of couple of years or so, particularly supermarket waste. So I think there's a few issues really. One about supermarkets and their relationships with farmers and the kind of conditions they put on fruit and vegetables, and the amount of waste that is thrown away before it even gets onto our shelves. So that's kind of one lot of waste that needs looking at. And then there's obviously the amount of waste that then is thrown away at the end of each day in terms of stock control and stuff from our supermarkets. We have had a lot of movement on this, so definitely in the last 6 months I would say supermarkets are getting a bit more savvy with giving their food away to charities and supporting stuff that the community are doing rather than throwing it away, which is obviously a win for the community and also a win for them because they don't pay landfill tax on that food that would normally go in the bin. I think we've still got a long way to go with that because I don't think it's the answer to the question. It's helpful, but we shouldn't have that waste in the first place. So just giving it away to a charity is not necessarily the answer, I would say. And also I think supermarkets have to meet us halfway somewhere with logistics and stuff around how that might work. I think us as consumers probably have a big part to play in that. So we need to make some noise about what we find acceptable and not acceptable, and what we're willing to buy in a supermarket as well. Are we willing to buy wonky vegetables and all that kind of thing, and put pressure on supermarkets to provide it, that we're not bothered about having perfect fruit and veg. And I think as well there's some kind of lower level stuff on a kind of a home kind of basis about food waste in the home as well. So then once it gets from the supermarket to us, are we being savvy about what we do with our food and our leftovers and making food stretch and that kind of stuff? So at York Food Bank we do a cookery and budgeting class called Eat Well Spend Less with some of our clients, and a lot of that is not necessarily teaching people how to cook, but hints and tips on how to cook from scratch, how cheaper that is, how to make meals stretch, and a lot about meal planning and only buying what you need and being savvy about your supermarket shopping. And is a deal really a deal in a supermarket, and all of that kind of educational stuff, which hopefully will keep waste down, but also secondly keep food bills down as well. So I think they are absolutely intrinsically linked. From a foodbank client that we had the other week said to me, when you're below the poverty line and you can't afford to accept invitations out for food because you can't afford to do it, or coffee, and neither can you afford to invite people around to your house to return the favour because you can't afford to cook for them, then friends and family just stop asking after a while, and your social network dissolves and falls apart if you can't take part in some of these social things. And I think as a culture, a lot of our social life does revolve around food, meeting up for coffee, going for breakfast, going out for evening meals, going to the pub, all of that kind of stuff. And obviously there's a cost implication to that. So loneliness is a huge part of food poverty for sure, and we hear that all the time from our clients coming in, that actually as well there's a bonding thing over food as well. It's kind of a common a thing that we've got in common as humans, and so it's easy to make friendships over food, and if you take that ability away from people, it can be really, really isolating. And also I think there's something about being able to be hospitable, and when you can't extend that hospitality to other people, that can be really crushing for you as a person too. So obviously Foodbank is trying to address that somewhat with giving people the ability to do that and the skills through the cookery course to be able to do that more effectively in the future. But also there's loads of things going on in New York, junk food projects, pop-up cafes, pay-as-you-feel lunches, all that kind of thing, so that people can come and partake in food, whether it's cooking it, preparing it or eating it, without any cost implication being part of that. And so I think that's kind of a wider city project that's going on, which we're a small stepping stone in. How can these issues be solved? Gosh, again, a massive question, and I definitely don't proclaim to have all the answers. But I do think one of the first things that we can do, that we can all do really, which is really practical, is just try and break down some of those stereotypes, because I think the media would portray people who come to Foodbank or who are in need in that way to be scroungers, out for anything that they can get. You hear all of this kind of real negative language in the media, and from our experience, that's absolutely not true. And people carry the weight of that stereotype. So I think we have to work really hard, not just in the media, but just within our own social circles, to not speak like that, and to break down some of those misconceptions, and to make people realise how easy you or I could be absolutely in the same situation. I know personally that if I missed a wage packet or two, I'd very quickly be in rent arrears, and that's often what we find at Foodbank, is that there's kind of a domino effect of events that leads for somebody who's at one point been completely independent and self-sustainable to needing a food bank weeks later. So I think that's something that we can all be very mindful of. There needs to be a shift in culture, I guess. Some of those issues that I talked about before. We need to get to know people. We need to build community. We need to talk to our neighbours. That is a massive step in helping people when they hit a crisis, to stop it from escalating into something bigger. So to build our communities again, which I know is a huge thing that probably takes a lot of time, but definitely something that's worth thinking about. I think in terms of just putting more money back in people's pockets, I think we need to have secure work. 0-hour contracts should be banned, in my opinion. They are just a cause of a lot of stress and anxiety for a lot of people. And what we need is not just that our unemployment levels go down, because actually our unemployment levels in York are pretty good, but that employment needs to be secure and sustainable and at a good income level, rather than people being in and out of work a lot of the time and in between jobs. So we need to look at our kind of our work and what that looks like in our cities. And that obviously to raise in line with inflation. Food education, I think, is a big priority. We find a lot of people who, you know, if they've not necessarily had a great family upbringing or they've been in care, have missed out on a big chunk of what it is about learning to cook and learning how food works and being savvy with all of that, because it's not necessarily school where you get those kind of life skills from. So I think that's another thing that we need to readdress in terms of our education system, kind of bringing some of those life skills back in. And also just a review of our benefit system in general, because I think the fact that food banks exist across the country on such a huge scale, and we're seeing such huge numbers of people falling through the net, means that our social security system isn't working. And also the words that we use around our social security, because again, at one point it used to be social security, and now we call it benefits, as if you should be grateful for getting this, rather than it being something that we all pay into and help people when they need it. So I think we really need to look at that, the structure of it and the language around it, because it's obviously not working as it is at the minute. So what are we doing as York Food Bank? I guess we're trying to play our small part in changing some of that. So I know for me personally as a food bank manager, I spend half of my time making food bank happen and half my time trying to tackle some of the reasons why people come in the first place. So that includes talking with local authorities, writing reports, gathering client stories, talking to the media, talking to MPs, all of that kind of stuff, so that we can talk to people who make some of the bigger decisions and give a voice to the people who come through the door who often feel like they don't have a voice. So I think we have kind of a social responsibility really, to be able to raise some of those concerns that we see. And in the meantime, we will carry on feeding people until that need is no longer there anymore. And I think as well, because we're run through local churches, and we obviously have a huge team of volunteers, we are trying really hard to build community. So we do have a befriending service for clients. So they might come in once for a food bank parcel, but someone will invite them to have coffee again at another point. So even if we can't help them with food again, we can carry on that conversation. We can help them, support them emotionally, as well as the kind of physiological needs, and befriend them really, and to tackle some of that loneliness. And we've seen some really great things down the line where food bank clients have come along, they've got to know people, they've got friends with people, we've helped decorate their houses, babysit their kids, all of that kind of stuff that kind of comes out of that relationship. And now some of those food bank clients are volunteers of ours, so they're back on their feet, maybe a year has passed, and they're now giving time back to us, which is the best case scenario for us. So we are obviously in the realms of dealing with food poverty, but I think you can't just contain it as that. It's such a bigger thing, and we're trying to look at the kind of wider picture as much as we can.